Hi, this is Corey Johnston. In today's lesson, we're going to be discussing the Tower of Babel, the story of which can be found in the opening 9 verses of the 11th chapter of Genesis. But there's a few passages in the 10th chapter that I feel are necessary for us to know in order to gain the background information upon which more of the focal point of our coverage can be amplified. So the 10th chapter is a genealogy. It is the third of its kind in the book of Genesis. We read of Cain's lineage in the 4th chapter and the righteous remnant preserved through Seth all the way till Noah, the 10 generations between Adam and Noah. There was a righteous remnant preserved along the line of Seth, of whom we read in the 5th chapter. And here we find the descendants of Noah's children, which would repopulate the earth. So there's a marked contrast between the characteristics of the Cainites and the Sethites, but they're all wiped out at this point. Only a descendant of Seth named Noah and his family remain. So he is charged the same thing which was charged to Adam, to multiply and replenish the earth. And as we read, or we'll get to that when we get to that, but genealogies are significant in Old Testament and frequent in Old Testament. We can read an identical account, not identical in word, but similar in range in the 1st chapter of the 1st book of Chronicles. And we also read one after the range we're covering today. We'll read of the genealogy and lineage of Abram, who became the father of the Jewish people and nation. And but we're not going to cover that today. So that being said, it just bears mention also that there are 70 nations. This chapter is alternately known as the Table of Nations. There are 70 nations listed from the 3 sons of Noah. This was not every nation there was to list, but it was often we see the number 70 repeating itself. It would have had numerological significance to the ancient Hebrews. Hence, we see that Moses was given 70 and the Savior commissioned 70. But we're just going to hop right to it. So the opening verse of the 10th chapter reads, "And this is the genealogy of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the sons were born to them after the flood." So Shem are for the Semites. These are the Semitic people of the Middle East. And Ham would be primarily, although not exclusively, his descendants would primarily, although not exclusively, be from Africa. And Japheth was the one through whom the Indo-European people, so all the way to China to Spain, was really populated by his people, and they were born, as it says here, after the flood. So their seed and their descendants and progeny would repopulate the earth from one end of Europe to the other end of Asia, all the way down to Africa. We don't know how the Native American people got here that inhabited the Western Hemisphere, but the Book of Mormon does speak of what they call Jaredites. These were people who were sent here. They were the original inhabitants of the North American continent. They have a whole book devoted to it, the Book of Ether in their Book of Mormon. Recommended read, but we only comment on this book. So moving on to we're just going to read the 6th through 12th verse of the same chapter. So Ham, remember, was one of the sons of Noah, and the sons of Ham, Cush, and Egypt, and Put, and Canaan. So these are his sons. Cush would have been an African nation synonymous with Ethiopia or the Sudan, and Egypt would have been the nation which enslaved the sons or the descendants of Shem, the Hebrew people. And Put would have been also in the Arabic or African region, and Canaan would have been the original inhabitants who occupied what was to become the nation promised to Abraham's descendants. And the cursing of Cain came from the earlier chapter when we read that Noah was drunk and his son Ham didn't do anything about it. He just kind of looked and laughed, and but his older brothers covered him appropriately, and for his transgression, the Canaanites were bound to be the servants of the Shemites, or one of the Semites. And the sons of Cush, Seba and Hiwala and Shaptha and Ramah and Sabdekeh, and the sons of Ramah, Sheba and Dedan. So these are children of his sons, and these would have represented nations. They would have sired nations known by these names, and the only ones we recognize is Sheba, which was located which corresponds to the modern country of Yemen in the southern extremity of the Arab Peninsula, and Dedan would have been the Arab people, broadly speaking. Saudi Arabia it corresponds to. All the rest of these I'm not familiar with, although Ramah does have the mention. There's a town, but not a nation of it, identified in the book of Jeremiah and repeated in Matthew 2. And Cush brought forth Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. So Nimrod, even though it has survived posterity as a term of reproach or a term of derision, it was in fact the name of the earliest empire builder. So we witness the evolution in the book of Genesis. Adam and Eve lived as hunter-gatherers in the Garden of Eden after they were expelled from there on account of the fall of eating the forbidden fruit. They become farmers, and by the sweat of his brow he must henceforth earn his food. And the earliest city dweller we read was Cain, who was a farmer originally. Remember, he offered the sacrifice of vegetables, which was inferior and less rejected, unlike his brother Abel's sacrifice, who was a shepherd of blood and meat. And but he gets assigned to a city which he names after his son Enoch, not to be confused with the seventh of Seth's lines and the righteous remnant, the one who lived for 365 years without dying. Him and Elijah are the only ones to know that distinction. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, and the land of Shinar. So the capital city, the focal and origin point, all roads led to Babylon, which is Babel here. It translates as gate of the gods, but also bears a striking similarity to the Hebrew word Babel, which means confusion. That's going to come into play in the 11th chapter. And Erech was a city of Sumeria, and Akkad was, I believe, people of Amorite stock eventually. And from the land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh and Rehoboth, and Keilah. So from the original Babylonian Empire, the one established by the world's first builder of empire, Nimrod, his empire would have extended to Assyria, and he built the capital city of Nineveh. So later when Judah is struggling for its existence, they're at the mercy of three imperial hegemons, those being the nation of Babylon, that founded by the Neo-Babylonian of Chaldean stock, which witnessed its greatest resurgence under Nebuchadnezzar, and also Assyria, which had carried and captivated the northern kingdom, their northern neighbors, away and scattered them throughout their empire. And they were around the cities of Jerusalem in the year 701 BM before Messiah, but an angel of Yahweh miraculously slays 185,000 of them in a single night. But they were originally consolidated in one empire, and resin between Nineveh and Caleb, the great city. So we don't know exactly where Keilah, the great city, is, but it is knowable. And we're just going to close with the closing verse of the 10th chapter. These were the clans of the sons of Noah, according to their generations and their nations, and from these the nations were divided on earth after the flood. So all humanity springs from this same root. We have a common origin. This is expressed in places such as Acts 17:26. So there's no superior race, at least from the start, although Yahweh in his providence does allow some nations to prosper more fully economically and geopolitically than others. We all share a common origin, and we our ancestors collectively founded the countries where we now live. And so the 11th chapter, this is the meat and potato of our lesson today. We read in the first verse, "And it came to be, all the earth had one language and one speech." So we have to understand that the arrangement of the 10th and 11th chapter is not chronological but literal. So these nations would not be founded until they were scattered accordingly. And this was probably to lead into Abram's genealogy, the fourth such in the book of Genesis, which reads to his calling in the 12th chapter. So after the 12th chapter, early Genesis can be divided into 4 stories: creation, the fall, the flood, and Babel. And the remaining Genesis 12 through 50 can be known through 4 human protagonists: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And it came to be, as they departed from the east, that they had found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. This would have corresponded to Mesopotamia or modern Iraq, where the city of Babylon once flourished. It was a sight to behold and a force to be reckoned with till it wasn't anymore. But even so, it has survived in symbolic significance as that which is of the world, that which is hostile and enemies of and alienated from and alienating toward Elohim. And so the symbolism endures even after the city was smote to ruins. And by the year 117 A.D., Trajan, the Roman emperor, under whom the Roman Empire witnessed the height of its territorial expansion, when he came across Babylon, he encountered virtually a ghost town. So it was, in fact, during the ancient world that this ancient metropolis would decline and ultimately die. And they said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks, and bake them thoroughly." And they had a brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. So the bricks they're gathering is for a building project that they have in mind, and that of which we read of in the next verse. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower whose top is in the heavens, and make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered all over the face of the earth." So the structure of this temple or tower, in all likelihood, would have been a ziggurat, which was the religious centers in the Sumerian and the Sumerian civilization, where they were structurally similar to a pyramid in that they crescended, but they also had a stairway built up. And the idea of walking to the stairways was not to reach to heaven, but to have God come down, condescend, whoever the temple was dedicated to visit you on earth. But here the goal and orientation is opposite. They're trying to lift themselves to the heaven. They are mimicking the sin of Adam and Eve to be like God, which is something that doesn't belong to them, and they are motivated by fear, we read, and pride. They wanted to build the site and center of the world and attract all nations around them. So this is truly a one world government of sorts. And in fact, the revelation, the beast, the system through which he rises and rules is also likened to Babylon, and it will be a one world government. And Then Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. Now, what would you do if you were in his shoes when you saw this arrogant and egregious aspiration amongst humankind to aspire after what doesn't belong to them, which is your unique possession? And so what does he do? And Yahweh said, "Look, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is what they begin to do. And now they are not going to be withheld from doing whatever they plan to do." So there was strength in the unity. This enabled them. They had all spoke the same coherent language. Everything between them was instantly and fully communicable. There was no language barriers among the denizens of ancient Babel who congregated around the center city, one of the many that Nimrod had founded. So this maybe occurred after Nimrod's lifetime. Again, we don't have a timeline between when all of this happened, and as I earlier mentioned, the Bible is not always arranged chronologically, but literarily, such as we witness the order and arrangement of the 10th and 11th chapter in the book of Genesis. But his concern was that they would take the license and liberty, they would abuse it, they would enhance their pride by the strength of their own unity and instill a false delusion of deity amongst themselves. So they would pilfer what doesn't belong to them and malign and corrupt it, what God knows to do best with, because it belongs to him and only to him. "Come, let us go there and confuse their language, so that they do not understand one another's speech." So he's prompted and motivated to move and intervene decisively, to physically scatter them, and to instill confusion. And the us is a plurality. This would have been Elohim in dialogue with himself, Yahweh, Yahshua, and the Ruach Kadesh. And this was, we witnessed the reversal of this curse in Pentecost in the 2nd chapter of Acts, when all denizens from all scattered all over the known world were speaking in tongues, which made what they said communicable to everyone around them. And as we read in 1 Corinthians 14:33, that God is not an author of confusion, yet he sometimes uses confusion, as we witness here, to thwart the evil and nefarious plans of man. "And Yahweh scattered them from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city." So over the face of all the earth, we can, it's not implausible to imagine that the Western Hemisphere people were literally picked up and placed to where they would dwell and remain. But the fact is that this one world government empire, the time was not yet for it. It is going to come to pass in the end times with the beast of Babylon is going to rise and rule through that platform, but its time was not yet. So henceforth, all nations would have their own fights for survival, their own culture, their own character, and there would not be the unity which enabled them to aspire to build after the heavens. In all likelihood, the pyramid, the Great Pyramid of Egypt, is 481 feet tall. This was the tallest building in human history for several centuries, but it's destined to collapse in 7,000 years. There's an Arab proverb that man fears time, time fears only the pyramids, but the fact that 481 feet isn't even close when we consider the dimensions of heaven. So these people really had no idea what they were getting into, so they were confused from the beginning, even though they were able to communicate amongst themselves. There is a way that seems right to man, Proverbs 14:12 and 16:25, but at the end thereof is death, and they totally deserved it. This is why the name was called Babel, because there Yahweh confused the language of all the earth, and from there Yahweh scattered them over the face of all the earth. So its name would be henceforth known as Babel. This was translated as Gate of the Gods. That's probably the name they gave to it. But in the Hebrew language, Balal indicates a confusion. So these people would henceforth be confused. They'd have to learn the languages of their distant neighbors in order to communicate them. That's an entire process within itself, but one that has been bridged in the passage of time, but it's still and they were scattered, so they would no longer be concentrated on a central location where they could elevate to their site and center of rebellion. And that's the ninth and closing verse. That's all the time we have for today, but we'll give you the Cliff Notes version. So Abraham, his lineage is described here. He was the 20th generation descendant of Adam. Some 2,500 years existed in the gap between Adam and Noah, and a somewhat shorter one would have existed between Abram, and as he was originally known, and Noah, because the length of lives declined in the post-Diluvian period. But he was a citizen of which was a prominent city of Samaria. So he was Aramaean, and he had a settled life. And we also read of Lot. And so the evidence indicates that Abraham was an idol worshiper from whence he hailed before he got the calling of Elohim. And so the religion of the true religion was virtually extinguished, and then God called from the sky an Aramaean wanderer to be the father of the people through whom the true and living God would be made known. And that's something I'm trying to pass on the torch, so I hope you're here for that reason, and it's good to see you. I'll see you soon. Stay tuned till next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.